Hi boys and girls, welcome back to Aunt Vicky's. I hope that you've been enjoying yourself, and as always, I hope you've been staying very, very safe. Well, I have a new point. I also have a new story for you today. And then Vicky wants to speak one moment about something. We have our little pets and we love to take them places with us. And if you remember, our last story was about Sir General Red the Rooster, who came to Leafy Farm and he was in a cage when they brought him out and left him. Well, Aunt Vicky loves to carry her little pet, and his name is Ollie Roo. He's a little chihuahua, and you can call it a cage, or I call it a pet taxi, and here's what it looks like. Right here, boys and girls. Has plenty of room for Ollie to breathe and to look out so he can see me. The main thing to remember that summer is on its way, boys and girls. Please do not leave your pets in vehicles unattended. And remember, if it's cool enough for you, it's cool enough for them. Always take water for them and always take a little snack, because just like us, they get hungry and want a snack too. Okay, let's see what Aunt Vicky has in her magical hat box underneath the magical teapot. A new story, of course, boys and girls. Now, we will read the poem, as always, and let's figure out if you can guess who the new character will be in the new story. The title of the poem is called The Cat's Shadow. It was a dark night and the wind blew with a ghostly sound. The shutters of the windows banged back and forth with an eerie pound. A cat's shadow did dance upon the wall in the light of the moon, as the winds blew and blew and blew a spooky tune. But ever so gentle and kind was the cat that made the shadow upon the wall, and she softly meowed and purred to her kittens with a loving call. It was a dark night, and the wind blew with a not-so-ghostly sound. The shutters of the windows banged back and forth, but with a more gentle pound. Okay, boys and girls, there's your clue to the new character in the story. So, have you guessed? Of course you have, and you're right. It's a cat. It is a cat, boys and girls. So, here we go. It's titled Cuddles and Spuddles, and abbreviated, Maudy comes to live on Leafy Farm. Okay, now you know that it's a cat that's going to come and live on Leafy Farm. And if you remember who Maudy is in the first book of Cuddles and Spuddles, it's the mama cat of the twins. And once again, the reason that I pointed out about the little cage and the pet taxi is that Maudy also is going to be traveling in a cage. So please, once again, be very careful with our pets, okay? Summer is almost here. Let's get started. Mrs. Leafy had just finished the morning breakfast dishes and tidying the cottage farmhouse. As she put away the last cup and saucer, the phone rang. Mrs. Leafy picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Leafy Farm." Mr. Rivers answered back, "Hi, Mrs. Leafy. This is your friend from the hardware store, and I needed to speak with you concerning the situation about me and Maudy." Mrs. Leafy and Mr. Rivers continued talking on the phone while Cuddles and Spuddles sat on the floor looking up at Mrs. Leafy. The twin kittens couldn't hear what Mr. Rivers was saying, but they could hear Mrs. Leafy as she said, "We are so happy about everything for you and Maudy." The kittens looked at each other at the sound of Maudy's name. They knew Maudy was their mother, but they had not seen her since they had came to live on the farm. Mrs. Leafy placed the phone back down and took her gardening gloves from the drawer and her hat from the rack. She went outdoors and began working in her garden. Cuddles and Spuddles were still sitting on the kitchen floor and were meowing back and forth to each other. Cuddles asked, "Why do you think Mrs. Leafy was talking about Maudy, our mother?" "I don't know," said Spuddles, "but I hope everything is okay." "Me too," said Cuddles in a very sad meow. The twin kittens didn't feel too much like playing, so they just sat in the big bay window seat in the warm spring sunshine. They could see Mr. Leafy had came back to the barn on his tractor, and they saw Mrs. Leafy motion for him to come over to the garden. Now Mr. Leafy and Mrs. Leafy stood talking and smiling and nodding at each other, and then Mr. Leafy got back on his tractor and away he went to plow the fields and plant his crops. The kittens lay sighing in the window seat and meowing a sad meow. Cuddles and Spuddles missed their mother Maudy so much, and at times they felt so sad they just wanted to cry. Maudy had missed her kittens too, but she knew that her kittens were much better off to live on Leafy Farm, so that they could run and play with Cap and all the other wonderful animals who lived on the farm. Yet Maudy had felt a loneliness and sadness ever since she had allowed the kittens to leave the hardware store. Mr. Rivers was a wonderful gentleman, and he loved Maudy very much and was ever so good to her, but somehow things had not been quite the same in the little store since the kittens had to leave. That whole week long, Maudy watched as people came and went in and out of the hardware store. Mr. Rivers had a big sale. In fact, the store was now completely empty. Mr. Rivers had placed a big lock on the front door that afternoon, and he and Maudy went upstairs to the apartment in which they lived. Early the next morning, Maudy was awakened by men carrying all the furniture out of the apartment, and they were placing it in a very big truck that was parked down below in front of the store. Mr. Rivers picked up Maudy and hugged her, and then he placed her inside a little cage. The men had taken all of the furniture out of the apartment, and the only thing left was Maudy in her cage and Mr. Rivers. "Well," said Mr. Rivers, "time for us to say goodbye to our hardware store and our home here. I hope the new owners will enjoy living here as much as we have." Maudy began to now understand that she and Mr. Rivers were moving. But where were they going to move, wondered Maudy. The big, beautiful gray cat had always lived in the hardware store, and she could not even imagine how they could live anywhere else. Gently, Mr. Rivers handed the cage with Maudy in it to one of the men who had been moving the furniture. The man placed the cage inside the back of the big truck and laid a cloth over the top of it and pulled the big truck door down. Suddenly, Maudy became very afraid, and it was just too dark with all that furniture and the cloth over the top of her cage. The poor cat could not believe it. Not only did she have to leave the only home she had ever known, but poor Maudy, it seemed she would never see Mr. Rivers again. Maudy's beautiful golden daffodil eyes were filled with the saddest tears ever. The truck was noisy, and the furniture rattled about, but on and on went the truck with the furniture and Maudy. Cuddles and Spuddles had not slept very well, and the next morning found them feeling as sad as Maudy, who was in the back of that big truck. The kittens had climbed back up into the window seat and watched Mrs. Leafy as she carried her mop and broom across the dirt road to the empty house next door. Cuddles and Spuddles meowed at Mrs. Leafy through the bay window, but Mrs. Leafy didn't hear them. Cuddles asked Spuddles, What do you think she's doing over there? Well, said Spuddles, this morning she told Mr. Leafy that the little house was dusty and needed to be cleaned. But why? Asked Cuddles. After all, nobody lives in it. Spuddles just meowed back that he didn't know why she was cleaning it, but truth was, it certainly did need it. The kittens had often went through the pet door at the bottom of the back porch door and played in the empty little house. Even though it was dusty inside just a bit, Cuddles and Spuddles didn't mind at all, because it was bright and cheerful and made a wonderful place to play in. Maudy was now sleeping in the cage, but as the truck turned into a bumpy road, it woke her up. All at once the truck came to a stop, and as she listened, Maudy could hear people talking. Then she heard the big door on the truck opening up, and someone had picked up the cage with Maudy in it. She felt herself being raised upward and heard a door open as she was being placed in the front seat of the truck, and then the door closed back. Maudy sat for several hours listening to people talk and the rattling and the moving of furniture. Now Cuddles and Spuddles had spent most all day napping off and on in the window seat, and when Mrs. Leafy fixed evening supper, she fed the kittens and Cap, the farm dog. Then she left and went back over to the little house. The kittens did not care if they were left in the cottage alone, because they still just didn't feel like playing. Poor Maudy had spent most of the day in front of the seat, in the front seat of the truck, and continued to listen to people talking and making all kinds of noises. But all of a sudden, Maudy recognized one of the voices. It was Mr. Rivers. Oh, Maudy's ears stood straight up. She listened very carefully and heard the door opening where she was sitting. Then once again, Maudy heard Mr. Rivers' voice as he said, "I will take her now," as the man who was helping with the furniture picked up the cage and handed it to Mr. Rivers. Maudy realized that Mr. Rivers was now carrying her, even though the cloth was still draped over the cage. She felt Mr. Rivers sat her on the floor, and she could smell her favorite dish and warm milk, as well as other delicious foods. Maudy could hear people still talking to Mr. Rivers, but she heard the roar of the big truck as it drove away. Mr. Rivers lifted the cloth off Maudy's cage and opened it so she could get out. Much to Maudy's surprise, there stood Mr. and Mrs. Leafy. Maudy came out of the cage, and Mrs. Leafy reached down and patted Maudy and said, "Welcome to your new home on Leafy Farm." Poor Maudy could hardly believe it. She looked all around and could see all of her and Mr. Rivers' furniture and belongings. It was the little, bright, cheerful house across from Mr. and Mrs. Leafy's cottage farm. As Maudy looked around, she could see how beautiful and neatly had everything been placed. She knew it would be the best home she and Mr. Rivers could have ever wished for. Mr. Rivers told the Leafys he was so happy that they could all be neighbors. And Mr. and Mrs. Leafy was as excited as Mr. Rivers and Maudy. "We shall miss the hardware store, I suppose, at times, but me and Maudy needed to retire and move out here to the country and breathe the fresh country air." He thanked Mrs. Leafy for the food she had placed on the table for him, and thanked her for Maudy's food and warm milk as well. Mr. and Mrs. Leafy told Mr. Rivers they would see him and Maudy tomorrow, and then they went back to their cottage across the little dirt road. Maudy began sipping at the warm milk in her delicious bowl of food. Mr. Rivers sat at the table having the supper that Mrs. Leafy had left for him. Cuddles and Spuddles heard the Leafys as they came in. The cottage farmhouse was peaceful that night, and Mr. and Mrs. Leafy sat talking and rocking away in their rocking chairs. Cuddles and Spuddles listened to the Leafy's conversation, and when they heard Mrs. Leafy say how wonderful it was going to be having neighbors, the kittens sneaked right out of their bed. Cuddles and Spuddles had no idea that people had moved into the house next door, and they both got very upset. After all, it was their playhouse. It was a dark night, and the wind made sort of a ghostly sound as it whistled along beside the corners of the cottage. The kittens felt a little afraid as they listened to the sound, but Cuddles and Spuddles had made up their minds that they were going to find out who was over there. The twin kittens sneaked across the little road, and as they did, they saw the light go out in the little house. They stopped for a moment and looked at each other, but still they just had to find out who was in there. When they got to the pet door on the back porch, Cuddles pushed Spuddles and said, "You go in first." "Okay," said Spuddles, "but you have to come with me." So both the little kittens sneaked through the pet door, and they saw a soft night light that glowed dimly over the top of the stove. The light cast shadows on the walls around the kittens, and all of a sudden the little house was no longer cheerful feeling, but instead it felt spooky. Spuddles shivered and nudged Cuddles as he meowed in a whisper. "Look at that big shadow on the wall. It's moving toward us." Cuddles was so frightened she could hardly breathe, and neither of the kittens could even move as the shadow crept closer toward them. Then they heard the shadow meow in a sound that asked gruffly, "What are you two doing here?" The little kittens were so afraid of the shadow that they couldn't even meow back to answer it. "Well," meowed the shadow again at Cuddles and Spuddles, "what are you two doing here?" Now the kittens could tell this time that whatever that shadow was, it was standing right behind them. As they turned around very carefully, they saw something in the dim glowing light, and it was huge and furry with great big staring eyes. "Well," said the shadowy furry thing, still staring at Cuddles and Spuddles, "aren't you going to at least say hello?" The kittens raced to the pet door as quickly as they could. They had to get out of there. But just as they darted and tried to go through the door, a big furry shadow had raced to the door in front of them and was blocking it. Cuddles and Spuddles ran straight into the furry shadow and then tumbled over each other as they tried to get up. Laying over one another, Cuddles and Spuddles looked straight up into Maudy's big, beautiful, golden daffodil eyes. Why, the kittens just couldn't believe it. It was their very own mother. Suddenly, Cuddles and Spuddles jumped up and began climbing and clinging to Maudy, and they all three rolled with laughter on the floor. Yes, Mr. Rivers and Maudy had came to live on Leafy Farm. That night, the kittens snuggled up beside Maudy and watched as a big full moon peeked out from behind a soft white cloud, and glittering beams of moonlight dazzled and sparkled upon them through the shiny, clear window. Once again, it was time for all on Leafy's farm to whisper a loving and sweet nighty night. Aw, boys and girls, isn't it wonderful? Now the kittens will get to grow up with Maudy, their mother. See how wonderful life can turn out. Sometimes it may not feel as though things are going quite as they should, but never get discouraged. And remember, there is always hope if you only believe. Okay, boys and girls? Now please leave me a comment and please write to me and I will write back. And once again, may I remind you to stay safe, okay, as you play outdoors and enjoy yourself. And also, if you will write to Aunt Vicky, I will do my very best to write back to you. And maybe you would like to send me a picture that you have drawn or something that maybe you have made. If so, please send it. And until later, what does Aunt Vicky always say? A sweet, kind nighty-night, boys and girls. Goodbye.